Welcome back to TACTCast, a production of the Tennessee Academy of Christian Thought.
Hey, Cameron, how you doing, man?
Hey, how's it going?
Going all right.
Good to see you again.
Yeah, you as well. So, we're gonna try a new format today.
Okay.
So you're gonna kind of take the lead on this Grindheim book, and maybe explain some concepts a little better, talk more generally. I think this will end up working better in the run, and maybe I'll take the lead on the next one or the one after that or something like that.
Okay.
But yeah, so what did you read this week?
So, well, I read, what is it, second chapter of Grindheim, what is this, Christology and the Synoptic Gospels.
Yeah.
And the second chapter is on the book of Mark. So, God's coming, Christology in Mark's Gospel. So, Grindheim talks about how Mark, or the author of Mark, portrays the role of Jesus, and what his purpose and what his description of Jesus is like, what his emphasis of who Jesus was.
Okay, so who does he say Jesus was?
Well, now that you asked, so the interesting thing is, basically, he says that Jesus is there's kind of a tension in that Jesus is God's coming to earth, okay? At the same time, he is the servant of God.
Yeah.
And so Grindheim says that Mark, the author of Mark, reconciles these two by also saying Jesus is the Son of God. So these three things we see emphasized in the Gospel of Mark.
So I watched it's kind of weird. Alright, so I watched a video yesterday that talked about some of these titles. So being called the Son of God.
Yeah.
And of course, Jesus' favorite title was
the Son of Man.
Son of Man.
Yeah.
Which...
And Grindheim talks about that.
Okay, so this video I watched was actually a former Muslim who's converted to Christianity, and he was giving a talk to a room of predominantly Muslims.
Oh, okay.
So one of the main critiques is that Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. Of course, Muslims do not believe that Jesus is God,
right, or
Son of God, or forgives sins like God, that sort of thing.
Sure. So
this critique on this, he said the Son of God was actually a really common
Son of Man.
No. The Son of God title was a common phrase. So we were considered sons of God in the family. In the Jewish tradition, he says that you can find that we were sons of God. And others were called sons of God. I think he said Moses, and somebody else was called a son of God. He said the Son of Man is actually an extremely unique title, referencing Daniel 7, I believe. And it carries this whole massive weight to it of a coming messianic figure who forgives sins and judges and everything else, so that the Son of Man title is actually the one that is more akin of being God himself. So the Son of God title, basically the critique that Muslims have is actually backwards.
Well, that's interesting. I think the answer is it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's the problem. Historians are always like, yeah, it's more complicated. So, and Grindheim talks about at least one aspect, and this is the Son of Man. So Jesus refers to himself over and over again as the Son of Man. And what Grindheim argues, following Richard Balcomb's work on this area, that in most cases, probably, at least in Mark, in most cases, Jesus is using the expression Son of Man just as a generic one that just it can be the equivalent of someone, right? So it's like, so it's a generic term, meaning it's a referential term in some cases, but in some cases it just means someone. However, when it is a self-referent term, there's an exception to that. There is one time when it's very clear that Jesus is referring to himself using the title Son of Man, and clearly has Daniel 7 in mind. And that is during the trial, in which the high priest says, what does the high priest say? The high priest basically questions him if he's the Son of God, I think.
Yeah.
And Jesus says, "You will see the Son of Man appearing in power, coming from the clouds on heaven." That's clearly a reference to the Son of Man in Daniel, and he's referring to himself.
So you would say most cases that Jesus uses the Son of Man title, it's just sort of a generic term.
In Mark, it is self-referent in some places, and when he does use it, referring to himself, I think what Grindheim argues, like the expression "Son of Man" in Aramaic is generally like just means someone, or like human being. But when Jesus does refer to himself as Son of Man, it is as sort of a representative of God. So I don't know that it's necessarily referencing in those cases Daniel 7. At least that's what Grindheim thinks, based upon Richard Balcom. But it is someone who forgives sins. It's someone who will judge the living and the dead in the future, at the eschaton. It is the Son of Man's Lord of the Sabbath. So even if he's just referring to himself and not specifically referring to the Daniel 7 Son of Man, he is a person of authority. And that authority is specifically God's authority. Forgives sins, judges the living and the dead, these sorts of things. So, and that's kind of actually the first part, right, in Mark, where Jesus very clearly, and Mark seems to be setting out initially, he's talking about Jesus has come as God in God's place, and we see that in the prologue. He even argues that this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and so it seems like that this gospel is Jesus Christ. He is the gospel.
So you would argue. So Grindheim is saying that essentially Mark. So Mark takes a high Christology. Mark does see Christ as God himself.
Yes, exactly. So, and often it's argued that that there's a development, evolution in the Christology, that the earliest Gospels, the Synoptics, have a low Christology. In other words, they don't describe Jesus as God, right? And that only comes about later in like John, which is much later than Mark. But Mark, assuming Mark is the earliest, which I think is kind of consensus, what Grindheim argues is that that the depiction of Jesus that Mark gives us is one who represents himself coming in the place of God, and that that he is initiating the rule of God, and he does this by taking the role of God, by having authority over demons, claiming to forgive sins, these sorts of things, and so he's taking God's place in that case. So. And then at the same time, he also does sort of appear as so he's coming in the place of God, but at the same time he also is the servant of God, and this is where Grindheim shows that Jesus seems to have viewed himself as having a role of the so-called servant songs in Isaiah. These are the passages where the servant comes and he suffers. He comes to serve, he gives his life, and Jesus. There's language in Mark. The language, it's more like a conceptual overlap with the suffering servant songs. In Mark, in other words, the language is not exactly the same as the Septuagint, but
so I've read or I've listened to, I believe it's Tobias Singer, the Jewish apologist, basically.
Okay.
Now, he says those suffering servant passages are specifically talking about Israel. Israel is the suffering servant, and it was only later that it's essentially like reinterpreted that Jesus, and these become sort of messianic, but Jews did not see it this way. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, I think what Grindheim's point is that Jesus in Mark saw himself in light of or as the suffering servant, in the role of suffering servant. And we can also see that probably in the Last Supper language, right?
Yeah.
My body is given for you, and this sort of thing. And so I think that's the point of Grindheim, that in Mark, Jesus does see himself as the suffering servant. So, yeah, and I think that's the point.
Yeah. So I do kind of want to. So this is, I think, a huge issue. Well, especially between different world religions, or an outsider's perspective looking at into Christianity, because a lot would see something like the Trinity as logically incoherent or something else. How can God be both infinite and in the finite at the same time? How can God be 100% God and also 100% man through Jesus? And of course, there's several passages Jesus seems to have limited power in some sense, or limited knowledge. So he says that even he does not know when he will come back.
Right.
Only the Father knows. So there seems to be the separation, and even in Christianity, there's this whole Unitarian sect of Christianity. Does Grindheim address any of that at all?
You mean like the Trinity, this sort of thing?
Yeah.
No, and because I think what Grindheim is trying to do is just discuss how Jesus, or how the author of Mark, right? Whatever you think about that, because he didn't really talk about that. How the author of Mark viewed Jesus, and it's very clear that he viewed Jesus as coming in the place of God.
Yeah.
And at the same time as the servant of God. And then Grindheim seems to indicate that this tension is resolved by Jesus also viewing himself as the Son of God. So he's, in the place of God, he's and yet servant of God.
Yeah.
And this is sort of reconciled, I guess, by his claims to also be Son of God.
Yeah. So, and of course, the reason that this is important is because one of the main arguments, I guess, in scholarship today is, or at least surrounding this topic, is that this view of high Christology developed much later.
Yeah, right.
And that first century Jews didn't believe that Jesus was God. But Grindheim is trying to say that Mark, our earliest gospel, was very clear that Jesus did claim to be God, forgive sins, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and you see that maybe most explicitly in the trial with the high priest, right? So the high priest asks him about that, and he says, you will see the Son of Man, and here you can see also this reference, I think, to Daniel. The Son of Man is going to come again. You'll see him coming on the clouds with power, and seated on a heavenly throne. And the high priest certainly interpreted that as Jesus making a divine claim, because what does he do? He tears his robes and says, we don't need to hear anything else, send him out, right? If he were just making a messianic claim about himself, the reaction would not have been so strong. But he's making this divine claim about himself. So, and so it's maybe not explicit like in John, but to the hearers of the words of Jesus, assuming these are the words of Jesus, Mark, they would have understood, and they did understand what Jesus was saying about himself. I mean, he sets himself up as over the Torah. He sets himself in a position of forgiving sins. He has command over nature. He has command, And Grindheim argues that the walking on water was a type of theophany, an appearance of God, because only God can do such things. The healing of the blind and the lame are clearly references to passages that the Jews would have recognized only God can do that, right? And so through his actions, he exhibits the authority that contemporaries would have understood only God would have had that authority. So Jesus is making those claims in Mark.
So maybe kind of a pushback against Grindheim. Well, obviously the disciples were told to also go out and heal and cast out demons and other stuff. So, and clearly they didn't think they were God. So is this just they're doing it through the power of Jesus?
Yeah,
upon them,
I'm trying to think if Grindheim actually is that in Mark where he sends out the disciples? That might be in Matthew.
Oh, that's a good question.
Where he sends out the disciples, says you're going to do all these things under my authority. I'm not sure. Let me think.
Yeah, perhaps we can
look at my notes real quick.
So I know. So there's always the fun issue to talk about of like the. Now this would be the last part of Mark, whether it was included in the original manuscripts or not. I don't think Grindheim is going to deal with that.
Yeah, he doesn't deal with that because he's just dealing with what does the author of Mark, how does the author of Mark depict Jesus? And it's very clear that he depicts him with this divine authority, this divine place, who is also a servant of God.
So yeah, I guess probably the part that I was talking about is the actual addition to Mark. So go into all the world, preach the gospel.
Oh, you're talking about the very
baptize,
end.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you were talking about when he sends out his disciples to cure miracles and cast out demons and that sort of thing. You're talking about the last passage. Yeah, Grindheim doesn't deal with that at all.
So, well, I guess when I initially brought it up, it was kind of like if because I mean, the general understanding I've always had is that the disciples could also heal, and cast out demons and things of that nature. So, if the argument was, correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe I'm misquoting what you said, or what Grindheim was saying, but if Jesus saw, or if the high priest or other Jewish would have seen Jesus performing these miracles, that only God could do these miracles,
right?
When very clearly there were other miracle workers.
Yeah. Right.
How does Grindheim address that at all?
He doesn't. Yeah,
okay.
He doesn't. That's interesting. Yeah.
So I think that might be kind of a, I don't know, maybe a bit of a critique of Grindheim. Perhaps that's something important in this particular topic, in this particular chapter.
Yeah, there are other. So he doesn't deal with like other miracle workers, but he does talk about when Jesus heals, it's depicted as doing it as God. So in reference, the healing of the lame walking and the blind seeing, these sorts of things. These are all the types of miracles that contemporary Jews expected of God's coming when His kingdom, His earthly rule. So he talks some about the kingdom of God, and Jesus talking about the kingdom of God and how that can be interpreted as sort of the kingly rule of God here on earth that's going to come right in the future. And when Jesus is talking about the kingdom of God coming and then performing these miracles, he is proclaiming it's here, right? And the miracles he's performing, the blind seeing, the lame walking, these were specific references to the Old Testament passages and extra biblical books that said, hey, at the end when God comes and fixes all this mess, this is the stuff that's going to happen. So I guess from that standpoint, it wouldn't matter that other people were healing. What matters is Mark is portraying Jesus as performing miracles that we contemporary Jews expect of the end times. So, and
well,
there's...
I think there was something kind of unique about some of his miracles, too, as they're usually accompanied with the forgiveness of sins.
Well,
specifically,
he specifically makes claims to forgive sins. That's right. And
this is something the disciples were probably not.
Yeah, and there, and particularly as Jesus is, and this sort of leads up to his entry into Jerusalem, and that's the story of the wicked tenants. Jesus tells the story of the wicked tenants, and the landlord sends all these servants, and they don't listen, and then he sends his beloved son to go and take care of it. And that's clearly self-referential. It's just prior in Mark's gospel to him going up to Jerusalem where he's going to be crucified. And so that's clearly in reference to Jesus viewing himself as sent by God, God's son, right? So,
yeah,
making those claims about himself. So,
well, does he talk about any other major points, or is that a good kind of summation of the chapter?
That's pretty much it. I think we've kind of talked about it. Jesus saw himself as God's son, God's servant, and in the place of God. All
right, well, good. Well, like and subscribe and tell us what you think. We're doing the YouTube thing now.
Yeah,
so,
it's been fun.
But let us know what you think of this other format. It's helpful. This is there's a little bit of trial and error kind of starting out these podcast deals. So, you guys have a great time. We'll see you some other time.
Next time. Yep.
Thank you for watching TACTCast, a production of the Tennessee Academy of Christian Thought. Be sure to subscribe, like, and comment. Make sure to follow us over on our social medias. Links in the description. Thanks for watching.